Alright guys, so we're going to have a bit of a quick video today because we're talking about Frieren. Or Frieren, Frieren, whatever. I only started it recently. I'm only about 6 episodes in, and I like it. I think it's really good. I think it's extremely well done. But my question is, how long do elves and dwarves live for? Because we get the implication that elves are extremely long lived, but we do not know what that means. How long lived are they? We know that Frieren is over 1,000 years old. We know that she considers a 30-year span to be basically meaningless to her. We know that a 50-year span is considered basically meaningless for her. We also know that humans only really live to around 80 years old, since we know that the hero Himmel starts his journey with them, adventures for about 10 years, and then 50 years later, he's an extremely old man. If we assume that he started at around the age of 20, 10 years later, he's 30, 50 years after that, he's 80, and he dies pretty quickly after that. So we know that humans in this fantasy world live about as long as humans in the real world currently do. And then we know that elves, or at least Frieren, looks at humans as like, wow, you guys have such short lifespans. It's like so hard to get invested in you because your lives are so insanely short. Fair. Totally cool. But what the fudge is their lifespan then? Because we know that she is 1,000. We know that she is not close to death. We know she is not near the end of her lifespan because she also says that she's scared of dying. She doesn't say the word she's scared of dying, but when she speaks to the priest, and she asks the priest like, oh, are you not scared of death? You're so close to it. You're so old. How are you not afraid of dying right now? Which means that she is afraid of death. She is afraid of eventually dying of old age. But how old is that? Is her species immortal? Are elves completely just immortal? They cannot die unless someone murders them? Because, like, if that's the case, cool, 100%, it makes sense. It doesn't matter how old she is. Any span of time will always feel meaningless to her. Even 1,000 years would feel like basically just a drop in the bucket to her. But also, she says 50 years is nothing. She says 30 years is nothing. She says 10 years is not even 1/100th of her lifespan. And I feel like that is a very important statement because 1/100th of a lifespan is 1,000 years. Now, maybe she meant that it's not 1/100th of the lifespan that she had already lived, because then, yeah, that would make sense. She was already over 1,000. And so, therefore, that 10-year span was not even 1/100th of the life that she had already lived up until that point. But then I'm like, well, then how long is her lifespan? And so I decided to look at other characters that aren't elves. I decided to look at Eisen. Eisen is a dwarf. We do not get the lifespan of dwarves at all in this series just yet. All we know is that she says that dwarves live long as well. When Eisen brings up that it's been 30 years since she last saw him, he seems to think that that is a somewhat significant amount of time. While she, on the other hand, says, oh, so not that long. And then he thinks about it for a second and then says, yeah, you're right. Meaning that it is in an awkward span of time where from one perspective it might seem like a long amount of time, but then when you think about it, for him, it's actually not that long. That's the implication that I get there, is that 30 years to him is maybe like a year to us, where it is significant enough to definitely think about, but not so significant that it's an existential crisis waiting to happen. But also, he's old. Like, it's straight up stated that he's old now and he's past his prime in terms of adventuring. But we don't know how far past his prime. We know that he partied or he adventured with Himmel and the gang for 10 years. We get the implication that he was still a little wet behind the ears when they started adventuring because he was scared to kill certain monsters. He still felt that level of fear. So the implication, at least for me, is that maybe he was not necessarily prepared just yet. He had been training. We know at the very least he was training. So maybe he had some level of combat under his belt. Maybe he was like 40. You know, he's been fighting, but he hasn't gone against like the Demon King's army just yet. So let's say he was like 40. He spent 10 years there, and then he spent another 50 years. So 60 years. He is now 100. Himmel dies. 30 years later, or technically 29 years, but we're going to round up and say 30. 30 years later, Frieren comes and meets him again. It has now been, he before was 40. When they stopped adventuring, he was 50. He is now what? 110? No, 130? So he's 130 years old. And he is now feeling old. He's now feeling past his prime. But he's also still pretty strong. Like, he still has a lot of strength in him. But that also could just be a dwarf thing. That dwarves are just incredibly strong in this universe. But how old is his lifespan? The implication, at least to me, is that probably 200 to 300 years based on the fact that he's already starting to get old. But if I live to 200 to 300 years on average, 30 years is still going to be pretty significant to me. That's a tenth of my lifespan. That would be like right now if someone were to tell me I have to wait 8 years for something. I would be terrified. 8 years is a long span of time. So for 30 years to be meaningless, he'd have to be at least living to like 800. Like at minimum, like 800 for it to make sense to where you see 30 years and you're like, all right, yeah, it is kind of a big chunk, but also in the grand scheme of things, I'm gonna forget about it. I'm gonna have, 20 more of those. So that is like, that gets more confusing because I'm just like, how old do they get to? How old was he when he's joined the party? And how old is he gonna be whenever he dies? Because we don't get an implication that he's dying. Like, we don't think that he's close to being dead. We just know he's past his prime. Essentially, like, he's at least the equivalent of being like a 45-year-old. That, like, when you're 45, you can still do stuff. You're still spry. You're not having any issue getting out of bed. But you're not gonna go try to run a triathlon, So that's like the implication that I get from him is that he's not dead, he's not dying, he's not like in the dwarf version of his 80s, but he is at the very least in the dwarf version of his 40s, maybe 50s. And so therefore, I'm just confused because one would imply that he's like that his lifespan is only in like the 300 to 400s, but then his view on how time is, his 30-year span view, implies that his lifespan is nearing the thousands. While Frieren, on the other hand, is completely unbothered. She looks exactly the same when she started adventuring with them as she does now. She still looks the same as when she was taught by, what's her name? Freda? Yeah, I think it's Freda. When she was taught by Freda nearly 1,000 years ago. She has not changed, like, at all. And so it just brings up the question, is she immortal? Because if she only lived to 2,000, like if that's her average lifespan, then it doesn't make sense that she hasn't changed at all. She should still be changing a little bit. It's been half of her life. She should be around the age of like 40 to 50. Since she's been alive for 1,000 years. She should be in the equivalent of like 40 to 50 years old. But she still looks like she's in her early 20s. So that would mean it would make more sense for her to be her lifespan to be at least 3,000 to 4,000 years. But then it's like, well, is that the case? Because we don't get any idea of how old she is. Maybe she's just immortal. I felt the need to rant about this, and maybe they'll explain it later on in the show. I'm still watching it. But I'm starting to get the implication that maybe Frieren is just straight up immortal, and maybe elves in general in this universe are just straight up immortal. Thank you guys for listening to my rant. Sorry I didn't get another edited, dark and darker video in. I'm very tired today, and I had to go to school, so I hope this is good enough for y'all. Good night.